And with that, it's my absolute honor to introduce to you today Alex Katz, who will be sharing with us on the topic of shredding the should. Alex says, in a society that emphasizes hustle, grind, and productivity, it can be easy to just constantly feel like you're not doing enough, even when you might be actually doing too much. It's time to start viewing rest as burnout prevention rather than burnout recovery. And I have a feeling that Alex has some pretty fantastic solutions and tools to share with us today that I'm also personally very excited to hear about. So Alex, we're so delighted to have you. Please do take it away and share your screen when you are ready.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here. And I am just going to share my screen. All right. Hopefully that's popping up for everyone. And just a thing to note about me, I love for everything to be as interactive as possible. So I'll be asking you to throw things in the chat and please feel free to do so. So hello, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Alex Katz. I am a coach, speaker, athlete, and nonprofit director. And today we're going to talk about shredding the should, which is one of my favorite topics. So let's get right into it, right? So along with shredding the should comes this concept of burnout, right? Let me know in the chat if you've ever felt burnt out. But what is burnout? I want to give you a story to talk about what burnout is. So I want you to imagine that you are cooking food for multiple people, right? You're prioritizing everyone else's food except your own. So your food is on that little tiny burner in the back right-hand corner. And you're trying to do so much that you forget about your food, and now it's burnt. So now you're hungry or hangry, right? And you're spiraling into a negative headspace. And you're feeling resentful of the people you cooked for, because if you didn't have to cook for them, this wouldn't have happened, right? Or maybe you're blaming yourself for being careless, for messing up, or maybe you're just so done with cooking, right? Has this ever happened to you in real life? Let me know in the chat if you can relate to this. This might be based off a true story. So this is kind of how burnout works, right? When you're trying to do all the things and you keep putting your needs on the back burner, you literally start to feel like this. Is that you, right? That is the toast that you left on that back burner. So what is burnout actually? Because while we might feel like this, we have to figure out what burnout is and how there might be different sources that are contributing to burnout in our lives. So there's actually not one clear definition. Let me know in the chat what you think of when you think of the word burnout. Right, so some of us might think that burnout is specific to work, right? But actually, there's not one clear definition. My favorite definition actually comes from Psychology Today, and you can find this in multiple other sources, but it states that burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and often physical exhaustion brought on by prolonged or repeated stress. So while it's most often caused by problems at work, like you might be thinking of, it can also appear in other areas of life, such as parenting, caretaking, or romantic relationships. And at its core, burnout happens when we experience prolonged stress and our needs are not being met. So there are a lot of stages that lead up to burnout, right? Let me know if you can relate to this. It's not something that comes on suddenly, although it might feel sudden. It kind of looks like this. It kind of feels like you're on a hamster wheel, right? Where you get tired, you feel overwhelmed, maybe you feel empty or like you're on autopilot. And so you start to disconnect, right? You're kind of just going through the motions and you want a break, but you keep going. You convince yourself that you just need more discipline. And so maybe you take a break, maybe you take a sick day, you take a day off, you go on vacation, whatever it is for you, and you feel a little bit better and you convince yourself that it's okay. And you just, again, need to be more disciplined or need to try harder. So you go back to what you were doing before and you get tired and then the cycle repeats. Let me know if you can relate to that. I saw this spoken word actually the other day that related to this so well, where she was saying how our lives sometimes feel like the insides of our journal, to-do list and the shopping list and your gratitudes and everything that you're doing for your mental health all gets jumbled up on one page. And I laughed because I mean, that I can relate to that. I've done that personally. And it reminded me very much of a client who struggled a lot with burnout. And one of the things we talked about was how she was putting her needs below everyone else's, right? And everything else in her life. And this was so true because when we actually had a coaching call related to burnout, she pulled out her notebook to look at a revelation she'd had last week and could not find it because she wrote her to-do list over it. And I think sometimes this happens in our lives more than we realize. So what causes this? What causes burnout? So it's a combination of internal and external factors, right? So let's start with the external, because I think these are the ones that we often think of. Maybe it's a demanding job. It's a heavy workload. It's a demanding boss, right? It could be things in your environment, maybe societal or cultural pressures. It could be external stress and expectations due to your socioeconomic status, your gender, or your race. It could be being a caregiver, or what we'll talk about today, the should shame, right? And we often think of these external factors and we think of them as things that are out of our control. But how often do we look at the internal factors that could also be leading to burnout? And what I mean by that is, how often do we examine our lack of boundaries or the boundaries that we are setting, right? Do we have perfectionistic tendencies, and how does that show up in our relationships or at work? Do we try to please everyone around us? How's our self-worth? Do we have trouble asking for help or delegating? Do we have a constant need for external validation? And then again, we come back to the should, shame, and villain thoughts, which I'll actually talk about today. Let me know in the chat if these are any of the things you can relate to, right? So burnout doesn't just happen because of one of these things. It often happens because of a combination of internal and external factors. And again, here is that burnt piece of toast. So again, what is burnout, right? At its core, burnout happens when we experience prolonged stress and our needs are not being met. But what do you actually need? How often do you stop and ask yourself, what do I need? This is something I do with clients who struggle to prioritize themselves. This is the first question I ask them to ask themselves first thing in the mornings, because it's really easy for us to wake up and immediately start thinking about all the things we should do, right? Our to-do list for the day. And it's not until later on, or when we are feeling burnt out, that we say, what do I need? If we say it at all. Sometimes we don't even know what we need, right? And part of that is, do we actually know who we are? So I want you to take a minute and just answer this question. You can throw it in the chat or just answer it to yourself. If I said, who are you? How would you answer that, right? I really think about this. So we have people asking us, how are we, all the time. And usually it's like, how are you? Good, 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 right? Like we don't really actually even think about the answer to that. But how often do you ask yourself, who am I? And if you do, how often do you actually have an answer for that, right? It's hard to know what we need if we don't actually even know who we are. And for most of our lives, we've relied on others telling us who we are, right? Or who we should be. And this is one of the ways where the should shame comes into play in adulthood. And we'll continue to talk about that. So understanding what steps to take to prevent burnout or heal from burnout starts with understanding ourselves. Okay, now I have another question for you. What do you do? Just take a second, think about the answer to that. So we just met and I asked you, what do you do? All right, now are you ready? Did you answer those two questions? Who are you and what do you do? Did you answer them the same way? So what I mean by that is, how often do we answer the who are you question almost like a resume? So for example, for me, I'm Alex. I'm a coach. I'm an athlete. I'm a dog mom. Versus I'm Alex. I'm energetic. I'm funny. And I'm resilient. Now, one of these isn't necessarily better than the other. There's no right. There's no wrong, right? How you identify is how you identify. But what I do want to highlight here is that we create so much meaning out of what we do, right? It becomes our purpose. It becomes our community, maybe our income source. It might have been something we've worked so hard to achieve, right? For me, coaching and my business, the work that I do, getting multiple degrees, multiple coaching certifications, right? Putting myself out there, it's something I'm very proud of. And so for that reason, it can become our sense of self-worth, right? And depending on our upbringing, our past trauma, sense of self-worth, it can be difficult to separate who we are from what we do, how we do it, and what others think about what we do. Let me know if you can relate to that, right? So again, it's difficult to separate who we are from what we do, how we do it, and what others think about what we do. So I'm really proud of what I do, and I hope that you are too. But it's so important to be able to be proud of who you are, independent of what you do. Right? Again, it's important to be proud of who we are, independent of what we do. But when we've grown up people pleasing, being compared to others, facing repercussions if we don't do something perfectly, right? Having our boundaries disrespected or not valuing ourselves, it can be so, so difficult to separate out who we are from what we do and to learn to modify these behaviors in adulthood, or even notice how these behaviors can be contributing to our chronic stress, dissatisfaction, or even burnout. Right? And for many of us, this might even have been a survival response, right? I know it was for me. Let me know if that's something that you can relate to. So let's talk a little bit more about our perceptions of burnout. Is burnout a badge of honor? Right? And so I'm asking this for you, for your perception of it, let me know. But I'm also asking this for society, because you might say no, but what does society say? I'm gonna check out the chat here. Yes, society. Yes, exactly. Somebody asked survival response. Yes, so I'll actually go back to that for 1 second. When I said survival response, I mean that for some of us, let's say you grow up in a physically or emotionally abusive household, people pleasing, not setting boundaries, trying to make everything perfect might be a way to keep you safe, right? So for me, actually growing up in an abusive household, I put everyone's needs before myself because I wanted to make sure that my parents were happy, because if they were happy, then that meant things would be better, right? So that's kind of what I mean by survival response. Trying to make sure people like you, because if people like you, then those things might be a little bit easier. So let me know, I hope that makes sense. Right? Everything is just learned behavior. Every single thing that we do at some point in our lives was meant to help protect us. No longer serves us now, and it feels so annoying, and we're like, why am I still doing this, right? It's really important to understand where these behaviors come from. All right, so yes, yes, I understand. So is burnout a badge of honor, right? Let's talk about this one. So some of you said yes, some of you said no. Everyone said in society, yes. And so 100%, right? We have a society that very much does value burnout. And it's funny because all of my adult life has reminded me of college. So, I think about college where we were all basically competing over who was the most burned out, who was the most sleep deprived, and who needed the most caffeine to stay awake. Let me know if you can relate to that. In case you're wondering, I drank 11 cups of coffee a day, so I definitely won. However, it was not good for my health, right? And it's interesting because at that point in time, I was working 80-hour weeks. I was a double major. I was, again, drinking the 11 cups of coffee, and I was praised for it. It was like, wow, you work so hard. You are so amazing. I wish I could be that disciplined or that dedicated. But this praise didn't stop me from developing health issues as a result later on, right? And that's something that we need to talk about. And I think that as we grow up, right, if we're praised for these behaviors, for our work ethic, for our dedication, we carry this into adulthood and we don't really know how to get out of it, right? So again, craving that external validation, other people are praising you, right? We do live in a society that values what you can produce and how much money you can make. And to some extent, there's a fear, going back to that external validation, there's a fear of being seen as weak or lazy, right? Which goes back to people pleasing and that external validation. We might be stuck on overdrive. Again, this might go back to, have you experienced trauma in your past, right? So your central nervous system, your nervous system might be stuck on high, and that might make it really difficult for you to slow down, even if you are no longer in a place of danger. And again, it might be a survival response, right? And this could be a survival response due to factors that you are currently facing, right? So I wasn't working 80-hour weeks because I thought it was fun. I was working 80-hour weeks because that was what was keeping me from being homeless after escaping my abusive household at 17, right? So we have to be able to decipher when burnout is being caused because we are afraid to set boundaries, we are afraid to put ourselves first, and when there are actual factors in our lives that are difficult, you can't self-care your way out of, but self-care is crucial in those moments, right? And I know next week you're actually going to be talking a little bit more about that, so I won't go too far into it today. And this constant need to go and do all the time might also be a distraction from other areas of our lives that we might not feel so good about. And while it's distracting us, it can also be leading to burnout, right? So we live in this rest when you're dead, go big or go home, hustle and grind culture. But as I mentioned before, prolonged stress and burnout can actually lead to chronic physical and mental health concerns. And that's really important, right? So just like when I was working 80-hour weeks and doing a double major and drinking 11 cups of coffee, I did that until I got really, really sick. And I actually ended up having to quit one of my jobs because I was so sick for such a prolonged period of time. It actually caused chronic bronchitis that I had for about 8 years because I couldn't take a break to even actually go get treated when it happened. And this is, just my example of my life, but I see this all the time with students, with clients, with friends, right? We rest when our body forces us to rest. We rest when we work to the point of illness. And it's almost like being sick gives us an excuse or permission to take a break. Let me know in the chat if you relate to that, right? It's almost like, man, it sucks that I'm sick, but I get to take a day off work. Let me know. I can't be the only one who's felt like that. Yes, 100%, right? Okay, so, but what happens if we could prioritize rest as burnout prevention instead of just burnout recovery? And what does rest even actually mean, right? Let's start there. So rest is not as easy as it sounds, right? We struggle with resting. And why is that, right? I know that's something that I've struggled with for most of my life, because when I was growing up, I was taught that rest makes you lazy or weak, right? That you need to go and do all the time. So that's where that guilt or that should shame will come in. Again, maybe you're going through stressful circumstances right now. And, going back to that lovely diagram where you're the toast in the middle, all the reasons why we struggle with burnout in the first place, right? So I want you to just think for a second, feel free to share what are some reasons that you struggle with rest. So contrary to all the people that are telling you you need to do all the things and that resting is bad and it makes you weak, research actually shows that rest not only makes you feel better, but it helps you perform better. Right? I'm an athlete. I do Ninja Warrior. I'm all about performance. And aside from athletics, we need to perform in our actual lives, right? Think about your performance at work, how you show up in the world, even just me giving this talk, right? If I'm super burnt out, this is going to be really difficult to do. But making sure that we rest helps us perform better, and it improves your concentration, creativity, efficiency, and task endurance, because they are all correlated with your brain's ability to recharge. So actually something I do with clients is I say, if you are feeling burnt out or stressed out during the day, I encourage you to take as many 5-minute movement breaks throughout the day as possible, because this can actually help you feel more awake, energized, and able to process information than that third cup of coffee. This is an actual statistic. I pulled it from an article I wrote actually a couple months ago. And it's so, so true. I want you to think about this. If you're working from home, I know that this is especially difficult, right? I have a client who really struggles with doing this because she says, well, if I take 5 minutes, that's time that I should be working, right? And I say, okay, but if you don't take 5 minutes, you are spending 2 hours staring at your computer screen saying, I should be getting this done, but I can't concentrate and I'm tired and I've been staring at screens too much. And I'm just going to go on Instagram for a second. I'm going to scroll Instagram and then come back to it. And nothing's really changed. Let me know if you can relate to that, right? She feels so guilty about even taking 5 minutes for herself in the middle of the workday. And I get it, right? You might be on someone else's clock. But what if I told you that taking those 5 minutes could save you a full hour, right? Instead of staring at the screen, wondering what to do next, you could take that 5-minute movement break, lay on the floor, breathe, go for a walk. I actually ask clients to do a 5-minute dance party, put on a song that you like and jump around, because that will, again, help shift your nervous system state. I also think about rest like our phones, right? If you have a cell phone, you can probably relate to this. I am notorious for letting my phone get all the way down to 1% before I charge it. And if you're somebody who does that, it is so much harder to charge your phone at 1% than it is if you just plugged it in at like 50% and left it there, right? Now it's at 1% and you keep doing this thing where you're plugging in, unplugging, plugging in, unplugging, right? Hoping that it'll just be high enough that you can just go for a walk and your phone's not going to die. We have to start thinking of burnout prevention the same way, right? If you wait for your mental and physical battery to get down that low that you can't unplug it for a few minutes, right? It's going to be that much harder to recharge. So you want to start thinking about what are small things that you can do throughout the day to be able to recharge your mental and physical battery. Right. So again, really driving this one home here because we have to rethink what we've been taught our entire lives. Rest is productive. I love saying it this way because, again, whether or not we want to admit it, we all care about productivity, right? We all want to feel super productive, but whether or not we admit it, that is kind of part of our should shame. So taking care of yourself and your health is not selfish. It is necessary. It is productive. And I know that you may be worried that resting makes you a bad mom or a bad wife or employee, whatever the who are you and what do you do question answer was for you. You might be worried that rest makes you not as good at any of those things. But I promise you that you need rest to be your best for all of those things, right? So shredding the should shame, preventing burnout, all of it starts with changing how you think about rest, right? And that is just as important as actually changing the amount that you rest, because unless we change the perception around that, nothing else changes. I also hate to break this one to you, but resting while scrolling is not resting. Let me know who has been like, I'm just going to take a break and scroll Instagram, TikTok, look at the cat videos, dog videos, whatever your thing is. Yep. If anyone feels called out, it's okay. I do it too, right? But unfortunately, rest while scrolling or watching the news does not count as rest. And here's why. And this is where we're really going to get into the should shame. So the reason is because you are actually having unconscious, might be conscious too, but unconscious physiological and psychological reactions to the information you are consuming. And your brain still has to work really hard to process this information. And if your brain is working hard, it's not resting, right? So let's talk about this should shame. I want you to picture this with me, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to take a break. Let me open up Instagram. And the first thing you see is somebody who looks really fit. And you're immediately like, oh, they look so fit. I should be working out more, right? And you're like, okay, I'm not going to look at that. And you scroll past that. And then you see the flood of engagement photos, wedding photos, baby announcements, vacations, new jobs, right? All the things. And what does your brain do? Whether or not you realize it, your brain is comparing, right? And it's saying, oh, I should be at that point in my career. Oh, my life should look like that, right? You start feeling all of the shame around what you are or are not doing in your life, because whether or not we like to admit it, we are constantly comparing to other things and people in our environment, right? And then the should shame goes even further because we feel that way. And then we say, oh, I should just suck it up. I should not be feeling this way, right? Or if you're feeling stressed out at your job, I should be able to handle this, right? Or my favorite, when it comes to boundaries, where we don't communicate our boundaries because we say they should just know that this is what I need. Let me know if you can relate to any of these shoulds. I think I've said all of them at one point or another. And a lot of times this happens unconsciously, right? Sometimes we notice it. Sometimes we're like, ooh, wait, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? Why is that happening? But sometimes it's so subconscious that the cues themselves might just be your heart rate is increasing a little bit, right? Maybe you feel on edge or annoyed, but you don't know why. This is why. So we don't realize how much this passive consumption of snippets, again, remember, just snippets, right? This isn't reality, but our brains think it is. Our brain doesn't know what's real and what's not. So we don't realize how much this passive consumption of snippets of other people's lives is actually increasing our stress response, low self-worth, and guilt, while we're actively trying to do something that we think is good and necessary for our health, which would be resting. But feeling guilty for resting while resting is not really resting, now is it? You like screenshot that, put that on your wall somewhere for a reminder. Feeling guilty for resting while resting is not really resting. So I want you to just take a second and reflect. How does this should shame cycle lead to burnout in your life? All of our shoulds are different. All of our shame around the shoulds is going to be different because so much of this is based on our past upbringing, conditioning, experiences, right? It's going to be different for all of us. So it's really crucial to stop and reflect on how this shows up in your life specifically. What are your shoulds? All right. And if scrolling social media or watching the news is not a productive way to rest, what can we do instead? So again, going back to the definition of burnout, burnout happens when you are really disconnected from yourself and your needs. So regardless of what you choose to do, my advice is to do something that helps you reconnect with yourself and your needs, right? To be more present is going to help you. And the more present you can be with your body, the more clarity you gain on that first question I asked, who you really are and what you really need. So practicing mindfulness is a great way to do that. And really, again, it's just about being present in your body and feeling less like an observer going through the motions. So if meditation's not your thing, that's fine. Traditional meditation's not mine either. I used to say I hated meditation. It just did not gel with me until I realized that meditation doesn't just have to be you laying on the floor in silence with your eyes closed, right? I think also that can be really difficult for trauma survivors, just throwing that out there, right? Creating that sense of safety and stillness. I posted on my story earlier, and I know She Recovers reposted it. For me, meditation is spinning around a bar that I have in the backyard. It's like doing a pullover and then spinning around it. That's when I feel really present with my breath and with my body and my thoughts. And that's my Zen place, right? So you need to find where you feel really connected, where you can listen to that inner voice. Maybe that's going for a walk, moving your body, sleeping, please sleep. We don't get enough sleep, or practicing gratitude. Let me know, what are some other ideas? What are ways that you feel present in your body, that you are able to connect with yourself? Just take a moment, think about that. You can throw it in the chat, share with me. So the key here, again, is to focus less on doing and more on being. Focus less on doing and more on being. But to be more, you have to really intentionally work on separating your self-worth from what you do, right? To be more, you have to separate your self-worth from what you do. So being able to separate who we are from what we do is a boundary that we can set with ourselves. And it also involves setting boundaries with other people. So what I mean by that is, especially now when so many of us are working from home, it can be really, really difficult to have that separation because we actually don't even have a physical separation, right? Especially many of my clients are in studio apartments. A lot of them like to live in cities, but they're in studio apartments where you're in the same room as your bed and your office and your kitchen and your gym, right? Let me know if you can relate. Or even in a house, right? There's not a lot of separation. There's no end of the day clock telling you, okay, close your computer now, work's over. And so this is where I want to challenge you to think about how, if you feel like you're overworking, how is your should shame playing a role here, right? So I'll have clients complain about their work and their demanding jobs, demanding bosses. And this is all really, really valid, right? They do have really demanding and time-consuming jobs and bosses. But when we dive into it a little bit, I ask them, when are you logging off, right? And what are you doing? So a lot of them are working past hours because they think that they'll make their boss happy. They feel like their work isn't good enough. They're trying to make it perfect, right? Let me know if you can relate to that. Nobody's saying that you have to do these things. And in reality, if we dive into a little bit deeper, nothing bad will happen if they don't do these things, but they really tie their identity to what they do. And so they overwork a lot. And when they're not overworking, they're putting other people's needs before their own. And I think, again, going back to that should shame, we need to figure out, when is this something that needs to happen? And when are we bringing this on because we're afraid to set boundaries, because we feel like other people won't like us unless we are able to please them all the time, or because we need that external validation. So think of a boundary that you want to set. Maybe it's work, maybe it's your personal life, right? What's stopping you from setting this boundary? What fear is coming up for you, right? Think about what boundaries you want to set and what is stopping you. Let me know in the chat, what's your perception of boundaries? Right? Because boundaries are actually necessary and important for your mental, emotional, and physical health. They actually increase your productivity. We can set them with ourselves and with others, right? Internally and externally. And they're not selfish, but they are an act of self-love. And I think for many of us, we've been taught that boundaries are selfish, right? That prioritizing ourselves and our needs, telling other people, voicing what it is we need, that's selfish. And your perception of boundaries is going to, fear of disappointing people. Yes, exactly. Yeah, right. So that's a great example. Thank you. So for example, right, if you are afraid to disappoint people, you're probably not going to set a boundary, right? Going back to that need to please. Setting boundaries is actually a form of self-advocacy. We've got physical, emotional, and mental boundaries that we can set. So for example, growing up, I wasn't allowed to close my door, right? That is a physical boundary that I was taught doesn't exist for me or doesn't matter, right? And as kids, we often need our boundaries to be modeled for us. Like, how do you set boundaries? Or we need them to be respected, to be shown, okay, it's okay for you to set boundaries. And I think if that doesn't happen, it can be really difficult for us to set boundaries as adults because we've been taught your boundaries don't actually matter, or somebody will get mad at you if you set them, right? Or you'll disappoint them. And we might set them, right? I might say, okay, 5 o'clock is my time to go outside and do pullovers. But the second somebody wants to do something with me at 5 o'clock, if I feel like I'm going to disappoint them, or they'll think I'm not a good friend, partner, whatever it is, maybe I bail on my boundary. So maybe I set it and said, hey, I'm doing this at 5, but then somebody else asks me to do something and I don't enforce it. And unfortunately, we need to teach other people what our boundaries are. And when we don't enforce these boundaries, then that's kind of what the expectation becomes, right? So I want you to think about, how do boundaries contribute to burnout in your life? They're hard, right? Boundaries are hard. And we can start by setting them with ourselves, right? So maybe it's that you know that work can wait until tomorrow. So the boundary is going to be closing your laptop at 5:30, right? And that's going to be a boundary that you set with yourself. Or maybe it's figuring out something else to do other than going on Instagram or TikTok, right? Or setting specific times that you're able to do those things. Maybe one for me is not checking my phone at 3 a.m. because for whatever reason, I wake up at 3 a.m. every night and my instinct is to go on my phone. And I've stopped doing that. My sleep has improved a lot, right? So the more you can practice your boundaries, the easier it becomes and the better your relationships become. And I know that there is this fear of disappointing or losing people. And I know that can be really, really scary. But when you do this, you actually figure out who supports the version of you that you are becoming, right? And versus who is there as long as it's convenient. So, in college, on top of my workload and 80-hour work weeks, I was everyone's designated driver and I was everyone's therapist. And it kept people close to me, right? You need me to do these things to you. And the second I realized that I couldn't do these things anymore because I was burnt out and I set a boundary, I found out really quickly who was actually there for me and who was there for me as long as I did those things. And now what I've learned is that if people are only there for you while you don't set boundaries, they're not really there for you, right? And it's so important. Yes, Mary brought this up in the chat, right? You keep promises to friends and family, but not the promises that you make to yourself. And the promises you make to yourself are the most important ones, right? We have to keep those promises to ourselves, and it becomes easier to show others how to keep promises to us, or for us to make promises to them. So if this is coming up as a fear for you, let's name it and work through it, right? So again, your brain likes to catastrophize. It likes to lie to you. It likes to tell you that if I do this, then this worst case scenario, horrible thing is going to happen, right? So if I take a day off, my boss will be mad at me. If I set a boundary, this person won't like me anymore, right? And you've actually put a bunch of great examples in the chat. So I want you to think about, what's a fear that's coming up for you? And then let's go a little bit deeper with it, right? So again, this might be based out of something that happened in childhood. And that's where inner child work comes in, to show yourself how the situation's different, how you are different, and to comfort that child and figure out what they needed at that time, right? So if you're able to build that awareness, working with a professional is a great place to then dive a little bit deeper into allowing that younger version of yourself to feel safe. And this is so, so, so important, right? I noticed for me personally, my people-pleasing behaviors in adulthood came from feeling like I didn't have quality friendships as a kid, right? So I wanted everyone to like me. I needed to do things for everyone to like me all the time. And no matter how much of that I did, I still felt like nobody liked me, right? And so it wasn't about the amount of people in my life. It was about diving in a little bit deeper and figuring out where that was coming from. Also, it's important to allow ourselves to play out that worst case scenario, right? So something I do with clients, I have them go deeper. So there's two things. One is, well, what if this actually works out? What would this look like? What would it feel like for you to actually set and enforce these boundaries and have people respect them? Okay, and then let's go on the other end to your worst case scenario, right? We often don't ask these deeper questions. We just kind of stop. We're like, well, my boss will be mad at me. And I'm like, okay, well then what? So what? Like, tell me what happens. What does your boss being mad at you look like? And a lot of the time we realize that we actually have the tools, right? Where we realize the scenario is not as bad as we're afraid of because we have the ability, skills, knowledge, or resources to be okay. And if we don't, right, that's a whole separate conversation. Like, do we need to actually seek outside help for this? So reframes on boundaries, right? And so you're not being selfish. You are just communicating your needs. You're protecting your time and energy because your time and energy is so, so, so valuable, right? And that makes you better at all the things that you care about. You are still a good person. You still care about others. You are still a team player and you are not selfish, right? And I also want to remind you, so this is a hero thought, right? I call all the should shame thoughts and villain thoughts, because if you think about, most of us have watched some superhero movie at some point in our lives, right? If you think about it, there's always a villain that comes in. And I mean, the villain's not your fault, right? The villain's just kind of there in our brains. It's like all these thoughts, feelings, conversations with people that we've had our whole lives. That's kind of where the villain thoughts come from. They're not your fault, but you get to be the hero here and come in and fight. And it feels like a battle, right? Because you're constantly going back and forth, trying to get these villain thoughts out of your brain. And that's kind of what it is in a movie too, right? It's a battle. It's not like you just fight it one time and it's gone, but kind of cool. You almost kind of get to direct your own movie, right? So hero thought, my worth does not depend on what I do for others, right? My energy is valuable and I deserve to protect it. Hero thoughts are literally one of my favorite things to have clients practice because we are filled with villain thoughts, right? But you are strong enough to go in and fight them. But again, think of it as a battle. You have to keep fighting it consistently. You have to keep showing up for yourself and being that hero consistently. All right, we're almost done here. Are you ready for it? Okay, so I want you to take a second now, later on, every day, right, to pause, reflect, reframe, and then implement, right? So understand how fear is stopping you, where the fear is coming from. And important point here, please observe those feelings without judgment, right? Like I said, it's not your fault that the villain thoughts are there, but that awareness is really key to being able to make a change and shredding that should shame. When we observe these feelings with judgment and we say, I shouldn't be feeling like this, what is wrong with me? Guess what happens? We're back in that should shame cycle, right? So again, please observe these feelings without judgment and know that you're not stuck and you are capable of making a change. Right. So again, think about how you can decrease burnout in your life, just bringing it back to this, right? Some factors are outside of our control, but there are some times where we are able to control these things, right? And really looking at this internal list again. All right, so some reflection questions for you, and you will get a copy of this whole presentation so you can have these to work through at a later time, but really sit down with yourself and ask, okay, what does self-care look like for me? Right? So I can't tell you the last time I did my nails, right? We have this kind of stereotype of bubble baths, facials, nails, right? No, it's whatever self-care actually looks like for you. And I think sometimes, again, we think that self-care is quote unquote bad or selfish because we don't know what that actually looks like. So ask yourself, what does that look like? How do you know when you're prioritizing or taking care of yourself? How have you come through for yourself in the past, right? Can you list times where you thought you couldn't do something and proved yourself wrong? And this is my favorite. Who do you want to be? And what would living in alignment with that version of yourself look like for you? Got some more, right? So how is your current environment supporting or stifling you, right? So somebody mentioned being afraid that others will be mad at you. Are those people supporting you? What boundaries can I set with myself or others? Who can I ask for help? I know asking for help is a whole separate talk, right? But who can you ask for help? What are my beliefs about work productivity, boundaries, and rest? And how can I add more joy, rest, and self-care to my life? You need to be really, really intentional about these things. Be intentional about putting yourself on your list, right? Be intentional about setting up, I block out calendar time for myself because it's really easy for a client to say, hey, can we move to 5 p.m. even though that's my time? It's really easy for me to say yes, but I actually make calendar dates with myself and I say no. And I trust that they're still going to want to work with me because I'm actually, honestly, I'm also modeling for them what I'm teaching, right? All right, last thing for today. This is so important. I want you to name the 5 most important things in your life. Feel free to throw them in the chat. Where are you on that list? Did you even make that list? My dogs, my recovery, my family, having secure housing, being alive. Ooh, I love that. Yes. Yeah. Right. So I want you to actually think about that. Did you make the list? because so often what I find with clients is that they're not on the list. They're worrying about everything and everyone before themselves. And it can be really confusing, right? Because you might say, okay, well, my job is on the list and that's for me because that's how I make money. But is it really, right? What does that look like? So again, going back to intentions. And if you're not on that list, what would it take for you to start thinking about yourself and your life like you're one of those top 5, to start acting like you're a top 5, right? So I want you to think about the person that you love the most in your life. This might be another trick question, right? Did you make that list? But what is one thing that you can do today to treat yourself like the person you love the most in your life? Again, be intentional. Set intentions for your day, for your life, right? Because if you don't, nobody will. We have to tell others what we need. We can't expect them to know what we need. We have to decide who we are. We can't wait for others to tell us who we are. We have to schedule that time for ourselves, because if we don't, nobody will, right? If you don't prioritize you, nobody else will. So don't wait to feel burnt out to prioritize yourself or your rest. Rest is productive. Self-care isn't selfish. Your health is your wealth and you deserve it all. Thank you so much for having me. I hope this was helpful. I know we're going to do a Q&A now. Here are some ways to reach out to me, and got a QR code here if you want to connect with me on Instagram. Always happy to talk. Just message me and let's do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. That was just chock full of just incredibly powerful tools. And I'm just trying trying to take notes as fast as I can. And I'm like, oh yes, of course, Alex is going to provide us with this replay, especially for those workaholics like me, perhaps, that are trying to absorb all the information at once. So thank you so much for that incredibly nourishing session. And, when you mentioned that part of your personal story was just having this, chronic bronchitis, it was just, it kind of clicked for me that this is such an experience that so many people can have that really do manifest in these, what we might think are kind of not congruent ways, right? The physical manifestation. I mean, we have to actually take a moment to think, why is this happening, right? And it can go on for so long, right? And then become, of course, burnout recovery. And, She Recovers has intentions and guiding principles. And one of those is, we believe in early intervention, right? We don't have to hit rock bottom to pursue recovery in any area of our lives. And from what I'm hearing here too, this really applies to burnout and our own self-care, right? We don't have to wait to have years and years of chronic bronchitis. We may think that we do, right? Because of conditioning, because of those maladaptive coping tools. So I personally appreciate the reminder, right? That like we can start, I can start caring for myself in a deeper way today just because I deserve it, right? Not because I'm experiencing some, significant health crisis or emotional breakdown in my life, right? Like personally, I was already well into recovering from other things when I realized that I was deep into my workaholism. And I had hit bottom. I couldn't swallow, and I was forced to take time off work, right, to focus on my healing, which I wasn't excited about at the time. Work was my identity, right? And so it was very depressing at first to have this, what I saw as an opportunity to take care of myself at the time, right? And I love the reflections that someone else had shared, is that working to burnout was a good distraction from other things that they may have been recovering from, right? And that taking that time to rest was like forcing them, right, to take an opportunity to work on loving themselves. So, and somebody else mentioned, it's like a muscle that I have to work at every day.
Yes.
And, part of my personal story, I won't go on too long here. We've got some great questions, but I intended to be off for a week. I ended up having to be off for 3 months. And I really did have to, at the beginning, trick my brain into thinking that self-care was work, right? So I started scheduling things into my calendar that was like, have your lunch, go for a walk, do a meditation, listen to music, read your book. I mean, I wasn't at work, but my whole schedule was focused on self-care. And I share that for the folks who are saying, I use work as a harm reduction tool. I totally understand. And I feel like if you have that mindset, there are ways that you can meet yourself, right? That's how I had to do it anyway, to be able to start having that muscle memory that other people have described. and sometimes we still need the reminder. Like sometimes I still need to have that reminder on my phone that tells me to take a 15-minute break, right? Because we're a work in progress. And so I love that you bring that forward, that essence of like progress, not perfection, right? Like I'm hearing that even doing some little things for ourselves every day can make a massive difference. And so that brings me to one of the first questions. Somebody says, I've never practiced self-care and I feel overwhelmed to even try and get started.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips just to take the first step?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing is to figure out what makes you feel calm, what makes you feel present in your body, right? And so that, for me, for example, that looks like anything related to fitness. And actually, to your point that you just said about working as a distraction, right? This happens in any aspect of our identities. Like, so for me, being an athlete became my distraction and it became my identity. And as something that I said I was doing for self-care, it then became a point of burnout, actually, right? I was coaching, I was training 24/7, I was competing. And I reached that point again where I was, injured, I was exhausted. So I think the first thing is just trying to figure out, okay, where are these sources of burnout coming from in your lives? What are you using as your identity? And then I actually want you to think back to when you were little, because I think when we're little, we kind of have this down, right? Like, especially when we're babies, we don't care about anything. We just kind of eat and sleep and do our thing. And then as we're kind of in that toddler phase, it's like, well, what did we like to do before the world told us what we should be doing? Who were we before the world taught us who we should be, right? So maybe for me, I used to love reading. Reading was my self-care in childhood. So now in adulthood, I'm trying to bring that back because somewhere along the way, I was told reading's not cool and I stopped, right? I think a lot of us do that. So it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be a whole big practice. I would say pick one small thing that makes you feel good. Maybe you go for a 5-minute walk during the day. Maybe you put on a song that you love that makes you happy and just dance around, or don't. Maybe you just listen to it. Maybe you just lay there and listen to it, right? There's no right or wrong way to practice self-care. I hope that helps.
I find that super helpful because it does also kind of showcase that different things are going to work for different people, right? And that we're worth the time spent on our healing. So if reading doesn't work for me, what other thing can I try? Oh, it's like, so that didn't work. It doesn't mean I'm not a failure, right? It just means I have an opportunity to dive into something else that might be more resonant for me. So thank you for sharing some of your personal tools. I love hearing that. And reading is cool. I will just
Reading is awesome.
note this, and I may be a little bit of a book addict, which I know, could use a bit of work, but reading has also just an excellent tool for me as well. So thank you for reminding me of that. And you mentioned the maladaptive coping tools, even in your response this last time, and somebody brought forward, they're asking, what are some ways I can reprogram some of the maladaptive coping tools I developed from childhood? For example, I kept silent and played small to survive, but doing this now harms me when I continue to lean on these tools. How can I break the cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is another one, and probably all these answers are going to be that it's one, you have to find what works for you, right? Because what works for me, works for Lisa, might not work for you. But I would say, first off, if you are working with a professional, it's a great place to start, right? So something I have my clients do is figure out where is this coming from, right? So you're starting to get there, right? And you're starting to figure out, okay, that I've developed these tools in childhood. And you're able to see, okay, that they're no longer serving you. So something you could do is, if you have a safe person in your life, you could practice with them, right? So let's say it's setting a boundary. So you could practice setting a boundary with somebody who's safe, who can respect it. If it's something like, let's say I'm a nail biter, I will admit that, right? And at some point in my life, that served me, that helped keep me calm, it helped me feel protected, and now it doesn't, right? So I'm starting with building that non-judgmental awareness, and then I'm saying, okay, well, I'm noticing that I do this when I'm stressed, right? A lot of times it's kind of like burnout, where it doesn't come on suddenly. You're starting to kind of have these physiological responses up until that point where you want to start biting your nails. So I would think about, okay, well, how would I like to respond instead? And obviously it's not going to happen right away, but I would start to think about, okay, can I remind myself that I'm safe, right? Can I start to bring in these other aspects that I want to do? So I'll give you another example. Like I used to be somebody who didn't learn proper emotional coping skills. So I would get really, really angry. And I would say that that's something that I couldn't control, but really that anger or anxiety, right? It's covering up other emotions. So I think being able to recognize before it happens that it's about to happen and say, okay, what tools do I have in this moment? And put your tools everywhere. The tools that you want to have, I put them up on my wall. I have clients put them on their computer screens, right? Just have it available, because when you're in that state of fight, flight, fawn, freeze, right? Whatever it is for you, you're not going to remember to do the thing. So you need to make it as accessible as you can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Somebody else has asked, how do I shed the shame of feeling I will never be financially secure? I'm educated, but don't feel successful because I don't have any money. And I think this is something that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. So first thing is I'm going to challenge what your definition of success is, right? So are you associating success with money, with status, with degrees, right? What are you associating it with? I will tell you, so honestly, I'll tell you a personal story in case this helps, just for you to see this, right? Left my house at 17, worked 80 hours a week in college, went straight from college to grad school, was so broke. I was working jobs in secret because you're working full time for the school and they tell you not to work outside of that. And then I graduated. I took a job at a nonprofit making significantly less money than I should be with even just a bachelor's degree. But I took it because my self-worth was so low that I was so afraid to go for anything higher. I couldn't negotiate the way that I had deserved to, right? So I was making like no money, more jobs on top of that, got into well, actually it was my dream job, but I was making real money, but I had so much debt from beforehand that I was still working 3 jobs and was burnt out up until, guess what? COVID. And then actually my position was grant funded. I lost it and I started my business full time, right? So what I'm going to say here is that for a really long time, I wanted other people to take a chance on me. I'd had certifications, I'm doing all these things, but I'm always working for someone else rather than going out and trying to do my own thing because, right, fear of failure, whatever it is, or this stability narrative. And what I learned was that where I was working, I had stability, or I had consistency, but not stability, right? So everyone says, you need stability. I consistently knew I was getting a paycheck every 2 weeks, and I consistently knew that I wouldn't be able to pay my bills, right? I was not in a stable place. And so when I was able to then shred the shoulds of, you have these degrees, and this is the path that, all these mentors have helped you get on, and separating myself from how much money I was making and said, I'm going to go start my own business. And I'm not saying you need to start your own business, but I said, what skills do I have? I lost all 3 jobs at once in the pandemic and I created my own business. And now I will say I'm the most quote unquote successful I've ever been, not because I'm making more, which by the way, I'm making more now than I was at this other job with my master's degree, but because I'm finally doing something that's in alignment with who I want to be. Right? I'm helping people, I'm speaking, I'm doing things the way that feels right for me instead of living out somebody else's purpose. So I would just challenge you to think about that. Like when I separated my self-worth from my title, for my money, for my degrees, right? I'm not saying that I'm like the most financially stable human now, right? But it's better. And I think that a big part of that is because I separated that out and I said, you know what? I don't care if I'm making less. I just want to do what's best for me, right? So this is kind of your reminder that your money doesn't define you, your degrees, nothing defines you except what you want to define you. And this is another part about the should shame. Every single other person is going to try to define success for you. Every single other person is going to tell you what you should be doing. And when I went to start my own business, I come from the world of psych and academia. And like, if you're not getting your PhD, like, what are you even actually doing? If you're not working for a university, what are you even actually doing? If I'm getting another certification, everyone's like, what university is that through? Right? If I'm publishing an article in a magazine, they're like, oh, peer reviewed. Like nobody understands what I do. And the real freedom for me, the real definition of success was realizing that I don't need anybody else to understand what I do. Am I happy? Great. I am successful.
But I want to thank you so much. This is incredible and totally what I needed. The timing was perfect. I wish that we could talk about this every week. And I know that there is a follow-up coming up next week with, and I'm blanking right now on who it is. But
yeah,
thank you so much, Alex. This was incredible.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. And again, if anybody has further questions, please connect with me on Instagram. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this community.